Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to the Muskogee Media's weekly press briefing with the executive branch. We have some special guests today joining us to help answer questions and give some info and insights into the CARES Act funding. Joining us is Mr. Jonathan Chattery, and I'm not sure where you're tuning in from, Jonathan, but thank you for coming. He is ambassador for the Muskogee Creek Nation. And as always, we have Muskogee Creek Nation Press Secretary Jason Salzman and my colleague and favorite reporter, Gary Fife. He's with us today, too. Thank you guys for all joining us today. Thank you.
Mado, it's an honor to be with you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Angel. Always good to be in this format every week and practicing transparent government, being able to talk with the citizens one-on-one and giving an update on the actions of the executive office for the week. And so very good and nice today to have Mr. Chowdhury with us, our ambassador for the nation. Certainly a person that I hold in high esteem, and so does a lot of others around Indian country. So it's a real treat for us to have him in this format today. So.
Definitely. I haven't got the pleasure to interview him yet. Some of my colleagues have, and he's always coming with some insightful knowledge for us, and we welcome everybody on board. Jason, can you kind of give us a rundown of your last few days? What's been keeping you busy over at the executive branch? How's it going?
Oh, man. What a great question, Angel. I tell you what, it's been a really quiet past couple of days. No, that's not true. we have rolled out just basic information, not really the finalization, because we're still sort of getting all of the application process and online set up ready for the distribution of the CARES Act funding. And the funding, it was a committee process that led us to this final stage. That committee was composed of not only grant professionals, but federal policy experts, commerce executives, and National Council representatives to not only report back to the rest of the National Council on the happenings in the committee, but also to provide citizen input on that committee. So really trying to, and as well as attorneys and Mr. Chowdhury himself, kind of weighing in on not only federal policy, but jury policy, things like that, just really being able to give good input and things like that. So really wanted to make that team up, catching a little bit of every kind of corner of this and what we've got to do as far as following the guidance set forth in this CARES Act, but also, meeting some need and doing some things that we need to repair and rebuild. Certainly a lot of things around the nation that have been hit and been gutted by the coronavirus pandemic. And also meeting immediate need of citizens out there who have, experienced financial turmoil, job loss, financial hardship as a result of the coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic. So really just that's a very, very big project. I can't really speak, in appropriate terms on how hard it is to a award of that size with this much to do in this little amount of time. And make sure that you're doing everything that doesn't have the IRS knocking a year out and making sure that you're good on that end. So very, very big task. And that's kind of the reason I wanted to bring in John today as well, is just kind of get his insight on what it was like inside of the committee and really the questions that were posed to the committee and the questions that I think some citizens ask now that maybe would help satisfy some of those questions that are being asked now that were on the inside process, really.
Mm-hmm. So for those of you turning in who are just kind of catching up, last Thursday evening was an extraordinary session where legislation was introduced to council that kind of came with the bones, the kind of, rough outline of how this money would be allocated in the different categories that the tribe prioritized with committee. And they set the funding for those the CARES Act funding allocations, and that was approved through council on Thursday evening. And so since then, there's been lots of citizens weighing in with plenty of feedback, kind of expressing their concerns, and some of them, doing so with expressing disappointment, is their concerns, or there's some that think it's fine. But can you kind of really shed the light on some of the guidelines that came with CARES Act funding? That's where I think I've had a little bit of trouble trying to catch up and understand. It seemed like the documents that were handed down from the Treasury Department were so less comprehensive than even our own legislation to distribute these funds. And can we kind of talk about those guides that the committee was trying to work within, and explain how they come to their conclusions?
Yeah, and I think even communication from the National Congress of American Indians indicated that there was some vagueness. There was some really a lot of up to interpretation problems that could arise for tribes whenever they look to quickly get these funds and disperse them. And you're having to act quickly, and with the vagueness and a lot of kind of the standards, you look at that and you say that could create problems for tribes because they kind of are waiting for direction here or there. But that's kind of where I was wanting to bring in John, because I think when you look at CARES Act guidelines, the number one guideline is that it must be COVID related to COVID-19. That's number one on the list. And so I think a lot of our citizens ask questions like, why does there have to be an application process? Why can't you just send a check, or why isn't just a stimulus, check our enrollment, we're enrolled pre, send a check? And I think, John, we're getting a lot of those questions. So is this kind of where you could chime in and kind of tell us where that doesn't really apply for a tribe such as the Muskogee Creek Nation?
Yes, sir. Well, first, I just want to say, it's an honor to be with all of you here today. I'm honored to join you on this broadcast, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about the CARES Act, what some of the guidelines are in that, and how, at least from an observer's viewpoint, how honored I've been to watch our leadership do the best it could with a very short timeline that was given to it by the federal government. So let's step back a little bit, back to March, when the scope of the pandemic was really starting to be known nationally and bubble up to Congress. In my service as ambassador, I was honored to be privy to a number of the discussions among tribal nations, as well as folks on the Hill, about what type of support, what type of stabilization funding tribal nations would receive as Congress was considering larger stimulus funding and larger stabilization funding. And I want to be very clear that nothing was guaranteed in those discussions. There is no guarantee that $1 was going to go to Indian country in those discussions. We all know there are powerful interests involved. And whenever you talk about federal funding distribution, you have a lot of voices at that table. So I, for one, am very honored to have witnessed the leadership of tribal nations across the country, including our own nation, Muskogee Creek Nation, to secure funding in the first place. I think that's a very important point to be made. Second, the funding that was secured under Title V of the CARES Act is different than the stimulus funding that individual United States citizens have received. The funding that was received in Title V of the CARES Act was established as an amendment to the Social Security Act to provide relief to states, tribes, and local governments for increased costs associated with COVID. It's very different than individual stimulus funding. This isn't an economic stimulus. Right there in the act itself, it states that these funds are to be, quote, for necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency, meaning the pandemic. Second, those expenditures are not accounted for in the 2020 approved budget of a given state, tribe, or local government. And finally, expenditures must be incurred between March 1st and December 30th. And so if we all recount that funding came in, just a couple weeks, just a few weeks ago, and the expenses that need to be incurred can only go through December 30th, you have a sense of the urgency to put together a plan that gets funding out for COVID-related expenditures as quickly as possible. So that's a little bit of the background. Treasury has issued a number of guidance documents at different stages of this rollout, none of which provide a very detailed set of explanations about what the funds can be used for and what they can't be used for. Ultimately, because of Indian country advocacy, hard work by tribal leaders and national organizations, a significant amount of funding was received, $8 billion in total, for under Title V of the CARES Act. And it's been kind of released at different stages. Right now, we're talking about the first 60% of the funding. The other 40% is going to be distributed quite differently, or is being distributed quite differently. But the one thing that's clear, even though Treasury hasn't provided very clear guidance, in all of the consultation calls Indian country leaders have had with Treasury, as well as all of their documents, the one main theme that's come out of all of that is that relief needs to be tied to coronavirus expenditures. This can't be a per cap expenditure. I mean, in theory, if you can tie every check in some way to a coronavirus expenditure, that's the best scenario. But in recognizing that in the interest of time, tribes would have to structure their programs different ways, Treasury unfortunately didn't give a lot of guidance. So Creek Nation, through the development of its committee, did its best to work with Treasury guidance and work through both what was allowable, what were allowable expenditures, and on the other side, what the priorities were of the government, rather than looking at things in a way that the nation couldn't look at them on. I mean, in a way that the nation wasn't allowed to look at them in, namely direct stimulus funding. The Creek Nation government did what it was supposed to do. It evaluated the appropriate priorities in light of coronavirus needs. Now, reasonable minds may absolutely differ as to the various weight of those priorities, how those priorities should have been allotted. And but I do want to just say personally, I've been at least honored to witness the efforts, the painstaking efforts that many on that committee, as well as many others in leadership, have made to do the best job possible, given the circumstances, to try and develop priorities that were consistent with the nation's morals, values, and philosophy. So I'm happy to go into more detail, but I wanted to hit some of those points. This isn't a stimulus funding bill.
Mr. Chaudhary, we were hearing that there was some opposition to tribal participation in this program. Can you clarify that for us and maybe tell us who it was that were raising objections?
Well, let me just clarify first my role. So my role as ambassador was to carry messages to federal leadership, work with other tribal leadership and national organizations to try and secure as much funding as possible for Indian country, but also to get as much clarification possible as far as guidelines. So my participation in our committees and in our discussions has largely focused on, hey, here are the federal guidelines. Here's the best guess about what can be done and what can't be done. As far as priorities go, that those priorities are really matters that have a lot of voices involved in trying to weigh. My hat and my heart goes to anybody who has to develop those priorities. But given the timelines involved, namely that these expenditures only account through expenditures through December, there wasn't, my hat really goes off to the decisive process that people had to undertake. I personally didn't witness any discussions about excluding anybody. I wasn't, it wasn't my role to weigh in on the priorities that should be assigned. But in terms of kind of the process, my role was to share what I could about what the CARES Act allows and to help assist with the process. Certainly in the process, a lot of attention was paid to the timelines involved, as well as the flexibility that if things aren't done 100% right, there is still flexibility to rebudget, and there will be another round of potential funding, and that part of that 40% that's coming down the road that can be allocated then. So some of these funds, the unexpended portions of which can be reallocated, the nation always has an opportunity to reassess its distributions, but more importantly, there will be another round coming up. So I didn't hear anything personally about anybody getting excluded. What I did hear was that we're under the gun because of the federal guidelines that are imposed. And as a community, as a nation, steps have to be taken to figure out how best to leverage existing infrastructures, namely existing program structures, to get the funds out where they're needed the most.
Ambassador, I have a question. So when we looked at those guidelines that were set forth by the federal government, and one of our guests in the chat is also asking this question, the guidelines, you know, we have to kind of, our committee has talked about having to interpret, you know, quite a bit. Is there any indication that that vagueness was to allow flexibility for these tribes and different governmental structures to find the best niche and need for this funding? And like when we are going to report how we've spent this fund, where is this oversight going to be going to on the federal level?
And thank you, Ms. Ellis. I should have pointed that out as I gave my initial recap. In addition to the allowable expenses that Title V of the CARES Act sets forth, it references some oversight safeguards on the back end. Specifically, the act, in a very vague way, authorizes the Inspector General of Treasury to be able to audit any distribution or any use of the funds, and any funds determined to have been spent in violation of Title V must be repaid. So I would absolutely say that the guidelines were written without much guidance, in the hopes, I mean, my hope is this is why they were written this way, but in the hopes that tribes would be able to quickly develop programs, develop grants in a way to distribute funds based on that specific government's needs. But I would caution against interpreting any of that language to say that anything's fair game after that. This wasn't stimulus funding. These were stabilization funds designed to address COVID-related expenditures. And yes, there is flexibility in how tribal nations can allocate those funds, but on the back end, there's oversight by the Inspector General's office with potential repayment with, I imagine, penalties and interests of any inappropriately expended funds. And I could share, oh, I'm sorry, please.
Oh, I was going to say, so for some of the tribes who are choosing to do direct citizen injections of funds, they're going to have to answer for that on the back end. And we're yet to determine whether or not that will be something that the Inspector General is going to say is allowable or not. Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, and I can't speak to any decision-making that any tribal nation, other tribal nation engaged in. On a personal level, I very much respect the sovereign status of tribal nations and their ability to make tough calls in a way that suits their own opportunities and needs and aligns with their own levels of allowable risk. But I would say that what one nation does it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best approach for another nation.
For our
John,
specific,
I'm
Yes.
sorry, can I just
Go
jump
ahead.
in right there? Because I think that's a good place to kind of have a small discussion here, because John, not only is he our ambassador, but he is the former chairman of the National Indian Gaming Commission, and so definitely knows tribal nations and their statuses and in regards to their size, their scope, their gaming operations, and what those gaming operations do for those respective governments. So, John, could you? We have a lot of citizens that do say, you know, there was a per cap given from this tribe or this tribe, but in all those cases, it seems to be much smaller, very very small membership, and not many gaming operations, not many programs. But yet, you look at the tribes that are closer to our scope, like the Cherokee Nation, that's rolling out a plan that's very similar to ours. So can you kind of speak to the setup of why certain tribes are service tribes from gaming revenues rather than payments with not many services?
Absolutely. What works for one nation doesn't necessarily work for another. And that's how gaming is set up. And that's how a lot of tribal enterprises are set up. And that's how the rules that apply to those enterprises are set up. Tribal nations should be allowed to develop programming and services in a manner that's consistent with their unique needs and opportunities. With gaming as a backdrop, let me just say, what will happen when the audits come that the Treasury Department is authorized to engage in is unknown at this point. We don't know exactly what audits will be done, although an audit of this distribution, I think, can be expected pretty much across the board. And we don't know specifically where Treasury is going to draw that line about necessary expenditures. But we do know things that can be done to minimize the risk to individual citizens, individual grantees, and the nation itself. And that is, the more that you can tie your distributions to actual coronavirus related expenditures, the safer you are, the closer you are to the actual language of the CARES Act statute. Now, individual per capita distributions without any tie-in to specific hardships or specific needs, who knows? Treasury at some point may say that's fine, but those types of payments make it that much harder to say, hey, this really is a stabilization distribution. This really is designed to pay for pandemic related expenditures of the nation or of individual citizens. If you don't have that, it makes it that much riskier. So I'm not going to say tribal nations that have done per caps are going to have to pay all that back. The fact is, it's impossible to read all the tea leaves from the Treasury Department's guidance. Even the biggest national organizations have tried to hold them to the fire to be more specific on many of these points. We haven't gotten full clarity, but the theme that's emerged from all these discussions is, if you can tie it to COVID, you should be fine. And so that brings us to how this distribution was set up. I very much appreciate the pressure and the pain that tribal citizens throughout this land face on a day-to-day basis. And to some degree, we're all impacted by COVID, whether it's knowing people that are impacted, job losses, inflation prices. The priority areas that the committee developed in conjunction with leadership, I think, do go a long way to addressing those various types of hardships. But a general pain is harder to tie to a payment in a way that you can justify through the course of an audit to avoid people or the nation having to return these funds. And it's not, I would go one step further. I mean, there are potential other liabilities beyond repayment that that folks should be mindful of. And so we don't want unintended tax implications for folks who ended up receiving something that doesn't fall in a general welfare exception and getting hit with an unknown tax bill. And I definitely appreciate the pain and the financial pressures that, I mean, we're not a wealthy nation when it comes down to individual members. And so there may be a temptation to look at the full chunk of the award and just do the math and divide by the number of citizens. And to that, I think a couple things could be said. First of all, the CARES Act, there's nothing in the CARES Act that authorizes that. The CARES Act has the requirements that I mentioned before. But second, the general purpose of the CARES Act was to support state, tribal, and local governments to support their members, their citizens, in a way that is consistent with those state, tribal, and local government programs, values, morals, and philosophies. So I think just dividing the number by the number of citizens, it kind of gives short shrift to what a government, any government, our government, any tribal nation's government, or the state or federal governments do. And what they do, or what they're supposed to do, is to provide a support system through programs and services, sometimes grant programs, to figure out how to provide a safety net. And not everybody benefits the same way because not everybody has the same need. And I just wanted to say, just as a witness to the effort and the thoughtfulness that was put into this by others, my role wasn't to serve as a decision maker. My role was to kind of bring back information from DC and information I've heard and working with other tribal nations to help provide the parameters of what can be done and what can't be done. And I don't want to say per cap can't be done, but that's probably we'll see what happens to other nations that went that route. And for them, that may have been the best route to go, but I don't think that that's the route to go for tribal nations with other size citizenship, tribal nations with other every tribal nation is different, and one size should not fit all.
John, I have a question. I'm seeing some questions popping up in the chat, and I think you kind of referenced it briefly on your observations of how this committee was tasked to frame out this legislation, and even you kind of referenced it briefly on your end in dealing with people in Washington. They're asking if what was the consultation like, and how often, like what was the feedback as our citizens and our leadership is looking for this guidance from the federal government side. What was their responses, and how often, frequently, things like that?
Well, let me be honest. There was a lot of frustration across Indian country about the Treasury Department's consultation in all of this. I mean, the Treasury Department worked closely with Interior and with the White House on both how to issue guidance and how to calculate the appropriate awards among tribal nations. This is a very complicated, controversial topic, and there are a number of lawsuits going on that speak to exactly that. Ultimately, Treasury decided to ignore a lot of submissions from tribal nations that tribes had submitted to help explain their membership and their needs. And let me back up a little bit. For this initial distribution, Treasury Department set up a portal and required tribes to submit all sorts of demographic information about their membership, their services, and tribes had to work almost round the clock to submit that. There wasn't a lot of input requested by Treasury when they requested that information, by the way. And when Treasury decided to distribute the funds, they used an entirely different calculation that relied on different data points, namely data points from housing that the tribes didn't think were connected to the CARES Act. And so, I can very much appreciate the concerns of any citizen about, hey, we weren't tuned into this process. But what I can say is those concerns are shared by tribal leadership throughout the entire country, throughout Indian country. And so there is litigation ongoing about the level of input tribal nations have had. Now, the level of input that citizens have had with Creek Nation's process, we're part of an elected democracy. Some things are, it is absolutely important to be transparent and to engage in dialogue as quickly and as often as possible. And I think that's what's been done here. As I said before, there are still many opportunities there are going to be opportunities to reallocate. There are going to be other funds to be distributed. But given the initial timeline to develop priorities that are consistent with priorities that have already been developed by Creek Nation, namely the types of programs and services that have been put into place, the process of having the committee that worked with, frankly, members of both the executive and legislative branch, who are all elected leaders, who are all put in there to work hard to try and support programs and services. That's part of our nation's process, and that process is supported by the by the free flow of information that this program and others that Muskogee Media does. It's supported by that process. So when you ask about consultation, short answer, the federal government is taking a lot of heat because of the lack of input that they listen to from tribal nations on the distributions. But here at home, back at home, this is a process in progress.
So one of our citizens here on the chat is asking, and this could be fielded by anybody who might know, I'm not sure on the answer for this one, but they're saying that the NCAI released a statement that stated per caps and cutting checks are absolutely not allowed. Is that true? We just kind of field questions from our audience, and does anybody have an answer for that one? I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, I think, go ahead, John.
Go ahead.
Well, I just, we referenced the communication earlier, and John and Devin and myself had already talked about that the NCAI was questioning and wanting clarification because so many tribes had reached out seeking clarification from Treasury. And I think John spoke about the frustration, and I share it, that we are under the gun, literally, to get something moving and something going with this, while also not receiving clear-cut clarification. And I just think that, as John just kind of briefly touched on, in that same communication from NCAI, it does speak of individual tax repercussions for citizens that would receive a check, just so to speak, just a blanket check with no, documentation of that first guideline of COVID-related expense, provided or stapled to the document, anything like that, or the application process. So I think there's a real concern about those type of things, not only from the tribe side, but we, like John said, we don't want our individual citizens being hit with tax penalties on something that we could have done our due diligence and seen coming. and sort of with the entire coronavirus relief fund, we're not looking at this as a band-aid, but more so of putting back and allowing flexibility in this fund for future outbreaks or future happenings, maybe in just as early as this coming fall. You know, we may see this again. We may have to lock down again. We may have to stop things. And, you know, we put that back, and we also allow with flexibility in the different buckets. And I've seen there's a lot of, you know, people out there that have misrepresented the 20s. I think they said the 27,000. They've only budgeted for 27,000. Well, that's just kind of they had to guesstimate to see, you know, about roughly what they thought would be affected job-wise. So there's flexibility in each of these buckets, and they made it so for that exact thing. And I've seen questions about flexibility. I've seen questions about citizens out of the boundaries, at-large citizens. This is open to all citizens. And those things also have been put in the requirements to expand eligibility. You know, we're going 400% above the poverty line, which I know a lot of people that have tried over the years to qualify for Creek Nation programs. You know, they say, well, we don't qualify for anything up there, but we're right kind of on that line where we need some help. And so that was kind of the thought in casting that wide net to get as many people eligible under these requirements as possible. You know, we still don't have the finalized application process out there and ready yet, but I think that was something that the chief and second chief really wanted to push as well, was that they made sure that there was flexibility in this because of the timing. And as John Adev has mentioned earlier too, just this has to be so quick on the turnaround that we need to get something going, but allow for flexibility in case we get more clarification from Treasury or more direction on what can and can't be, and it's a little bit more black and white and less gray. And I think that's important to note all of those points.
I have another question popped up in our chat asking if anyone has sought clarification from Treasury, and I believe that almost everyone I've interviewed on this topic has said we have sought clarification from Treasury on multiple occasions. And I have some documents that I'm going to link into this interview as it goes onto Facebook that shows the guidelines and the frequently asked questions. And this is just kind of it's not really funny, but it kind of is how convenient of the federal government to dump $282 million in your lap and then give you very little clarifications. They spend it in 6 months, knowing that they would probably be able to recoup any unspent funds back to them. It looks like almost money moving PR strategy from a citizen perspective who doesn't always see the federal government as being the most transparent thing in the world. But that's neither here or there, and that's probably my opinion. But when you talk about the eligibility requirements, Jason, I've kind of been reading through some of the legislation, and these are the preliminary outlines of these newer programs that are being developed, and people talk about those eligibility requirements. Can you talk a little bit about that 400% of poverty, guideline? It looks to me like a lot of the comments indicated that people are afraid that it's going to boot them out of any kind of assistance whatsoever. But it states that as long as you make under 400% above federal poverty levels, right? So yes. I'm looking at that legislation, and what typically happens when you apply to any federal program that's tied to federal funding is they want to look at, the need and things like that. In this case, it's like that eligibility looks like it's expanded by 400% of what you typically would see. Is that correct? Am I reading that properly?
Yes, of the normal, what you would see normally, like what the qualification would be before this hit, and you normally, went and tried to qualify.
So say, for example, if I have filled out an application for my family for food distribution, and on that income guideline, it says that a family of this size should make this much money. For these specific programs that are funding with this legislation recently passed on Thursday, my chances are 400% greater to qualify for them than it would be, say, for example, food distribution.
Yeah. So like Angel, let's just take a scenario. Like if you're a one-person household, just you, and you try to go get, you try to go sign up for commodities, and your household income is of you, just you, is $51,040. Do you think in June of last year you would have qualified for commodities?
Absolutely not.
Well, you would qualify under this hardship program at that level. A household of 4 can have up to income of 104,000. A household of 6, 140,000. So they've really been expanded. I know that a lot of people, that was one of the things that the committee really wanted to key on was, we know a lot of citizens out there I never qualify for those programs anyway, so what good does this do me or anything like that? We wanted, like Tara said, cast the widest net we possibly could. And had to work with the federal government and guidelines and things like that in getting that poverty level, that percentage up to a spot where we thought, this is going to be able to catch as many people that would maybe fall through the cracks, because we realized there are cracks in our system. There are a lot of people that are right above the line that's before this happened, but right above that line that still need help and support. And it's unfortunate that they do fall through those cracks a lot of the time. So that was kind of the impetus and the motivation behind getting this percentage up so high.
John,
Jason, let me ask you real quick. Is there going to be some opportunity where citizens can say go to a website and see these kinds of categories and eligibility guidelines? I mean, right
Yes,
there in black and white.
Yes, sir, Gary. I'm glad you asked. That's another thing is we've been working really hard to sort of, it went from council passage to now it's in go mode this whole week, getting the whole application process, which you can imagine is having to get all of that together, get temporary workers in to maybe take the manpower of some rolling out all new programs, and who knows how many people will be applying and this money and the amounts and everything like that. So it's a big job. And so this week we're also getting together, after council passage, making sure that nothing was sent back or that didn't go through or approved. Now the communications team getting together our entire packet, which will include the guidelines. It'll include NCAI communication. It will include all of the black and white, as you said, in the requirements, the eligibility, and then the income levels as well that I kind of just mentioned there off the cuff. So thanks for that question, Gary.
Before we cut everybody loose, I had one more question for John.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the second phase of this funding could roll out differently. Is that what I heard? Or might have been.
Yes, and it's so hard to anticipate why Treasury it's so hard to figure out why Treasury has made the decisions it's made. It's my understanding that tribes have started to receive the second part of the funding, and that's very different. It's based on a completely different formula that Treasury picked, and whether or not that's even going to come close to this round, I can't speak to at this point, but there will be at least some funding that comes from that second 40% bucket, but there's still pending litigation about portions of that funding as well. So I'm honored to see our leadership in action trying to do their best, trying to develop priorities that make sense given the need of the governmental need at Creek Nation. I also appreciate the individual concerns that folks have, but I do want to share one thought as somebody who always had a foot in Creek Nation, but because of my dad's work, my mom's work, spent a lot of time in Arizona growing up. I've got a lot of family in Arizona and California, 1,000 miles away. The point that Jason made about the guidelines being cast broad enough, the Creek Nation guidelines being cast broad enough to provide hardship relief to citizens all over the country while it's not a per cap, I get the desire of some folks to want a per cap, but I have major reservations about the tribes that went that route, although I respect and honor their decisions to. While the guidelines that Creek Nation set forth aren't a per cap, within those buckets of priority, there's not a tie-in to geographic location. Namely, if you lost your job in Kentucky, that matters. If you lost your job in Arizona, that matters. And that's all reflected in the guidelines here. And I think that makes sense given the realities of our nation. And so was honored to see that be a part of the calculation.
Go ahead, Jason.
Real quick, I just wanted John to clarify just very quickly, John, and I'm so thankful for you coming on with me today. I know you're a busy man up there, but I had one more question, and I think it's important that we address this too. One of our citizens, Kara Medina, is asking if it's the gaming operations expense and a specific bucket of our CARES fund is going to shore up tribally owned business and enterprise. And she has questions whether that's even allowable under federal guidelines. And I think we really had a back and forth on that because our gaming is, whether you like to admit it or not, and I know we want to diversify our economic revenue streams. That's really a hot topic at different forums and election time. You know, we need to really diversify. But the fact of the matter is gaming is the lifeblood. It pumps into all the services and everything that happens throughout the year. Simply put, without gaming and with the major budget shortfall for the gaming operations, it could be disastrous and devastating for the tribe. Now, do we need to change that in the future? Do we need to start moving more towards a diversified economic revenue stream? Absolutely, we do. But the fact of the matter is, at present time, it would be disastrous. So, can you just talk about, the shoring up, maybe the tribally owned businesses and enterprises? I think she says that she believes that would be more likely to get us in trouble than a per capita payment, which would be to putting it towards tribally owned businesses.
Well, getting into the weeds a little bit here, certainly things to cover payroll expenses, employment expenses growing out of COVID. That's very much part of the purpose of the tribal stabilization. And so there are ways you have to route things, and there are ways that tribes can determine what are businesses or small businesses that are part of the tribe. But I'm very proud that Creek Nation continued to support its employees during this crisis. The decision of our leadership to do that when people were sent home to protect their families and Creek Nation families, but they still were paid. That really is a hallmark of leadership. And Creek Nation, I catch taxi cabs and Uber rides just like everybody else does. And when you hear folks talk, they recognize that and they appreciate the fact that employees still got paid in this crisis, just like they did when River Spirit was flooded. I mean, that shows our values as a nation. Those types of expenditures are recognized as COVID expenditures. Where it gets trickier is lost revenue. And tribal nations have worked very hard to secure what funding there has been. And there is quite a bit of funding under CARES Act Title V. But I still think across the board and across Indian country, the lost revenue hasn't been fully accounted for by Congress, because the revenue that gaming operations such as ours bring in to shore up our community, but surrounding communities, we're economic drivers for not just Creek Nation citizens, but the entire area. So the committee made some hard cuts to say, well, these types of things, such as employment expenses, these types of payments are allowable, other things aren't. I want to be clear, based on everything I've seen and I understand, we're not just saying, well, how much did you lose? And we're just going to pay you, gaming enterprise for how much you lost. That's not how it's being approached. What support gaming has had is very consistent with the support of other enterprises. You look at COVID-related expenditures and you work back from there.
So one of the things that I noticed in the guidance, and I'm pulling up the treasury.gov document for coronavirus relief guidance for state, territorial, local, and tribal governments. And it says that the CARES Act provides that payments for the fund may only be used to cover costs that were not accounted for in the budget most recently approved as of March 27th for the state or government and were incurred during a period that begins March 1 and ends December 30th. So I think that like when people think about that payroll expense, while it was great to have our nation's employees, working and receiving, their income and things like that. At one of the interviews that we conducted earlier with our cabinet member, Chair Branson, stated that the budgeted things that were already budgeted, already a part of an approved budget, not necessarily something we can kind of reimburse with this fund. But as the casinos or whatever go forward and they're having to make plexiglass separations to keep people safe, or the supplies that they're purchasing and things like that, it seemed like that was kind of what was easier to tie to coronavirus relief funding.
I think that's an excellent point. And I actually don't know one piece of this that maybe Jason might be able to help out with. It's kind of a minor piece, but it's my understanding that enterprises have to go through their own justification and own application process when they receive support from this. And yes. Is that correct?
Yes, there's a form for them as well. Yes.
Yeah, and so believe me, there's nothing I hate more than forms, and I recognize that some tribes aren't requiring their citizenship to submit forms for relief. But let me just say that as painful as that process is, I mean, whether it's an online form or mailing in a form or even texting something, I'm just personally, I hate forms, but the submission of the forms just help with that overall argument if and when we ever get audited or anybody gets audited, to say, hey, this was all part of the eligibility process that Congress set forth. And folks who may be rightfully frustrated by forms, at least it may be helpful to know that enterprises are having to do this. I mean, everybody's got to do it. Other tribes may do it differently, but it's not my understanding that it was intended to be overly burdensome, but to help connect the chain between the distribution and coronavirus.
One of our chatters in the chat, Natalie Harjo, is asking whether or not recipients of the individual or family support would receive a 1099 for the assistance that they are granted. I know some of our programs work that way, like school clothing. I believe people do receive those 1099s, but I'm not sure on that.
Without being absolutely sure, I would defer to if you've taken part in any of the social services or TANF programs, it will be extremely similar because they are going to be sort of in charge of rolling this out, these social service programs, these human services programs. So if you've taken part in that, it'd probably be similar to those processes.
Might be something we'll have to like kind of iron out as we get more coming. Is there any, before I like cut everybody off, and is there any?
No, I just wanted to let John go because I think, like I said, I wanted him to not be too long, but I wanted him to just kind of jump in and take part with this. And I certainly appreciate his contributions today and us giving some of his time.
Definitely. Thank you.
Well, and thank you all. And I just very much appreciate the opportunity to engage in this virtual way with folks, with citizens who have questions. I'm just been honored to talk to all of you, but just as, if not more honored, to answer the citizens' questions. So it's an honor to me to work for the nation. Mado.
Thanks so much, John.
Okay.
So Angel, I guess we could switch back to really just kind of the updating on what we've got going on as well. And then I'll kind of, like we do normally, I can open it up for any questions you guys might have. But got confirmations starting tonight. So that will be going on of cabinet officials and everything like that. An exhaustive process, as I've explained before. The chief and second chief and their team of interviewers looked over, 80 in-person interviews, which is quite a bit going on in COVID life. So it's been an exhaustive process. I think that they feel like they've done everything to find the absolute best candidates for those positions. And now, let the Muskogee Creek Nation governmental process play out and wait for confirmation from full council. That'll be happening this week, as I said. Both of those gentlemen are also with their respective interview teams going over vacant board positions now this week as well, starting the in-person interviews, and some of them have been Zoom interviews, as we like to do a little Zooming here now and again in this post-COVID, or I guess during this COVID world. I can't wait for the post-COVID world, let me tell you.
But I just can't wait for football.
Man, I can't wait for just anything other than all of this. Just ready to get past it and get back to some sense of normal, and where we can get back to what we do best, which is push this nation forward and make sure that we're doing it in the best way possible for not only our operations but the citizens as well. So and now with that, I'll just open it up to any questions that you might have. I wanted to give you one more update. I'm sorry. We did get the technical report in, Angel, and if you would be available tomorrow morning, I'd like you to come over and take a look and go over that and be able to use that for your reporting. That would be great.
Awesome.
And we're excited about that and excited to see your work published on what was also another unfortunate incident, but one that we kind of, swift, decisive action and got it taken care of with minimal damage. So.
And last time we talked, you had mentioned that there was the report had indicated that there wasn't anyone's personal information compromised. Is that right?
Right. That is the conclusion of the final executive report as well.
Good deal. I just wanted to jump back to the board appointments real quick.
Yes.
Along with the board appointments, is there any word on whether or not we'll have any judicial candidates coming back up through the council? I think the last time we seen a judicial nomination was Judge Pittman, and he was not confirmed in council, and so we're kind of sitting in a little bit of a limbo space on a couple of cases that don't have a judicial candidate until it's confirmed.
I will ask the chief about that and get back to you as soon as I possibly can on that subject.
Awesome. All right, cool. I think that's about all I have for today. Gary, you got anything good?
No, I'm good.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jason. Maybe just to wrap it up with, is there any word on when people would begin to apply for those individual services?
So we basically wanted to give it a full week to put those things in process. So start looking for the application process. We're hoping beginning of next week. I really, don't want to put an exact date on it, Angel, because I don't want to be the Jason Salzman said, but we're hoping for the beginning of next week to where we can start rolling these out. And as I've always said, the good thing is the people that have been financially affected by COVID-19, definitely financially affected by COVID-19, they're going to get some help from the Muskogee Creek Nation. We're going to be able to help those folks out with some hardship programs, as well as, really shoring up the tribe for the future as well, and enhancing some things that we already do. And like I said, on the back end, making sure that there aren't these big, huge shortfalls when we come to October and we're not able to even function as a tribal government and get services out to our citizens throughout the entire year.
All right. Well, I think with that, we're going to wrap it up, sign off, and thank everyone for watching, and remind you all that we do this every single week on Tuesday afternoon. Come subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook. You can always ask live chat questions as we're conducting interviews, and become a subscriber to our channel, and you can get a notification on when we're about to go live. And I want to thank everyone very, very much for all their patience for this very long press briefing. I think we set a new record.
All right. Yeah, I did too. And I'm glad, that's a long time, but thanks for hanging in there with me, guys. And I appreciate you all every week and all the work that you do.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.